Good evening, everyone. If you can hear and see me already, please let me know. We'll wait for a couple of people to arrive and then we'll get started. Feel free to share this to your page, Fergus, or profile. Okay. "12 people here already. Welcome. Just doing a few things here.
So far, I'm not seeing anything on there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've seen 2 black boxes with each of our names, and that's it.
On Facebook?
That might be, that's my mistake. It's fine. It's fine.
Oh, right.
I hadn't pressed the actual play button.
Right, okay. Yeah, that would help. Hello, Andy. Hi, Collie. Hi, Maddie. Hi, Ashley. Ooh, there it is, Kirsty. How nice of you to join us. Community standards. Oh, that's new. Okay, just doing 1 or 2 things and then I'll be ready to go. That's 3, 2, 1. 58 people here already. Goodness me. Right, so without further ado, let's see here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, everybody here, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Naughty Autie in Conversation. My name is Harry Thompson, your host, and today I'm joined by Fergus Murray. Hi, Fergus. Hello. Right, so Fergus Murray is an autistic writer, science teacher, and community organiser based in Edinburgh. Their mother, Dinah Murray, co-created the theory of monotropism together with Wenn Lawson. So, as always, I'm going to begin by asking you, Fergus, how and when did you discover that you were autistic?
Right. So, my mum started thinking about autism when I was probably about 12. So circa 1990, maybe a little bit later. But I didn't think that there was enough about me that matched up with the characteristics of autism until I was about 30.
Okay.
And I think around about the same time as my mum came to think of herself as autistic as well, I started seeking out a formal assessment.
Okay.
So that was about 12 years ago now.
Right, okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. So Fergus joins us this evening to talk specifically about monotropism. Monotropism, does it not matter?
It doesn't really matter. Dinah didn't seem to have any strong opinions one way or the other, but she did always say it monotropism herself.
Right, okay, then that's what I'll be saying myself, monotropism. So now, monotropism is perhaps regarded by many autistic academics and autistics alike as the strongest autism theory to date. And I, for one, am extremely grateful and excited that Fergus is here tonight because monotropism is pretty kick-ass stuff. So Fergus, could you please tell us what monotropism is?
So monotropism is a theory of autism. Dinah always talks about the mind as an interest system. So a system of interests, where an interest in pretty much the everyday use of the word is something which draws our attention in, right? It's something which our attention is drawn to. And the idea is that autistic people have relatively few interests aroused at any time. So most people will have a bunch of processes going on. Like you'll be talking to them and they'll be thinking about social relations and they'll be decoding your speech and body language and facial expressions and tone of voice and social context all at the same time. Which is largely baffling to a lot of autistic people.
Yes.
not necessarily all of us. Like, you know, the more you practice something, the less conscious attention it takes.
Okay.
So that's part of the story of monotropism, is that one reason why autism manifests so differently in different people is because we have different interests.
Different interest.
I think it's worth saying that it's a little bit broader than just attention and interests, really, because it seems more like our processing resources in general are more focused than other people's. They're less spread out over multiple channels.
Right, okay.
And we sort of have fewer processes running at any time, is a bit of a computer science way of thinking about it.
Yeah, of course.
So those can be interests, but I think it's useful to think in terms of filters as well as active processes.
Yeah, sure. When I imagine the autistic attention tunnel, it's a little like fiber optic, like in nature, through which attention is distributed intensely down the fiber optic tunnel. And one of my questions was, how does neurotypical cognition differ from autistic?
Yeah, right. So, yeah, autistic people are prone to entering attention tunnels, where anything outside of our immediate attention is likely to just not be attended to. Either that, or we're ripped out of the attention tunnel and we have to attend to the other thing and we totally lose track of what we're doing.
Right. So school.
Sorry?
So school, in a way.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to enter into an attention tunnel and like flow states in your average school.
Right.
Where, you know, you're a class of 20 or 30 kids and there are people talking in the background, and there's all of this stuff to process at once and things are changing regularly. So non-autistic processing tends to be polytropic.
Right.
So that the average person will have, you know, all of these processes running in parallel, basically. And they'll think it's weird when someone can't simultaneously decode all of these channels of information, for example.
Yeah.
They're less likely to be intensely interested in a small number of things persistently. Although I have to say that I am one of quite a lot of autistic people whose intense interests are anything but restricted. So I'm very interested in lots of different things, but I'm really intensely interested in a few things at any given time. I think this is associated with being more towards the ADHD end of things.
I was going to ask, are ADHDers monotrops or monotropic? Because it's interesting. My analogy to distinguish perhaps an autistic conversational style from a neurotypical conversational style is like, as autistic people, it's like dolphins bounding deeply into the water, whereas a neurotypical conversational style is more skimming a rock, you know, across the surface, and it can bounce from one topic to another quite quickly. And it's like, whoa, I'm not ready to move on from this yet. I was just getting deep into my flow state, talking about one of my special interests, and suddenly the conversation changes and it's really, really, really stressful, you know. But the neurotypical people participating in the conversation seem to be okay with the more transitory nature of the conversation.
But one thing that's really interesting is that I think from the other side, it kind of looks a bit similar. So people who don't have a handle on autistic cognition quite often feel like autistic people are jumping all over the place, where for us, it's like, it's a clear, you know, one thing follows another. But we see different connections.
Okay.
Basically, and that's so much the difference between autistic and non-autistic cognition, is just the kinds of connections we make, and and the ways that we make connection. So it has a very strong tendency to mean that a lot of things that are obvious to most people are not obvious to your average autistic person. But a lot of things that are obvious to an autistic person are not at all obvious to a non-autistic person.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So how can the autistic diagnostic criteria be explained through the prism of monotropism? Because I understand that that is something your mother attempted to do and explain.
Yeah, so Dinah Murray, my mum, back in when was it? I want to say 95, but it wasn't. It was 2005, wasn't it? Published with her friend Mike Lawson, Mike Lesser, and Wenn Lawson.
2005,
the
yeah.
Journal Autism. A paper titled "Attention, Monotropism, and the Diagnostic Criteria for Autism."
Right.
So I guess at that time it was still the DSM-4
Yeah.
I had to refer to. So the diagnostic criteria have changed a little bit, but not really very much. So yeah, broadly, it's social communication, social imagination, and restricted and repetitive interests, right? Back then, anyway. The idea that social communication and social imagination are completely separate. It's kind of, I think people realize that was a dead end, and they don't really talk about the triad of impairments anymore.
Right.
So a lot of the social stuff can be explained by the tendency for autistic people to attend to fewer channels at a time. So neurotypical communication tends to be very highly parallel, right? Like I was saying before, you've got words, tone of voice, body language, facial expressions, social relations, and also all of those go both ways, right? So when you're having a conversation, you're supposed to be like doing the right things with your face at any time, which most neurotypical people seem to not have to put any effort into. If you're autistic and you have to interact with neurotypical people, as we do generally, a lot of us have to actively try and make the facial expressions that they would expect to go with what we're saying. Like I've trained myself to smile a lot more than I used to, because it turns out that sort of having a face that is just not doing anything is widely read as grumpy and sometimes disapproving, and people don't like that. So I just, I smile by default. It's something I've trained myself to do. What was I saying? Social communication. So there's a two-way thing going on there. Basically, because we attend to fewer channels of information at a time, our whole communication style is different. When we're talking to other autistic people, that's usually not a problem. Depending on how used to talking to other autistic people they are, and how much you're on the same page, and so on. Like, it's obviously both being autistic is no guarantee of smooth interaction, just as both not being autistic is no guarantee of smooth social interaction. For those who aren't familiar with these ideas, I'm basically talking about the double empathy problem here, as coined by Ben Lawson. I sometimes think of it as the two-way empathy problem, because I think that requires less explaining. But yeah. The name's stuck, so what can you do? So following on from that, the whole social imagination thing, imagining what someone is thinking if they experience the world very differently from you is difficult, right? Empathy is not just this like magic thing that normal people can do automatically. People get it right a lot of the time because other people are quite like them.
Yeah.
And it's not just autistic people that this assumption that empathy works automatically hurts. It's, women, it's gender minorities, it's ethnic minorities. Anyone whose experiences are significantly outside of the dominant narrative empathy regularly breaks down for them, you know. So people think that Black people are experiencing less pain than they really are. There was a terrifying paper out about a week ago suggesting that women who are treated by male surgeons are about a third again as likely to die as women being treated by female surgeons.
Really?
Yeah, so this is a problem, you know, across all kinds of marginalized groups,
So
minorities
really,
and so on.
it's an empathy problem.
It's an empathy problem. Yeah, empathy just isn't as easy as people imagine it to be.
Yeah, right.
So naturally, autistic people with a fundamentally different experience of the world, you know, we have a different sensory experience, because one of the things about monotropism is that we tend to throw our processing resources at wherever our attention is, and that includes experiencing things intensely.
Yes.
As well as missing other things. So yeah, I mean, social imagination, it's not an autism thing, it's a cross neurotype thing. And then there's the whole restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests, as if that makes sense as a category, where, yes, I mean, autistic people tend to keep on looping back to our interests, right? One of the things about monotropic thinking is, if you're throwing a lot of attention and processing resources at a train of thought, it kind of leaves deeper grooves in the mind, right? So we tend to keep coming back to the same grooves again and again. We tend to kind of loop back to things.
It has more gravity.
Yeah, it's like that. Yeah. So yes, we tend to be intensely interested in things.
Yeah, say that again.
Passionately so, you know. I tend to prefer the term passion to the term special interests. I don't hate the term special interests. I don't reject it wholesale, which a lot of autistic people do. But you know, it sounds a bit special. Special is just a little kind of dodgy word in modern English. So
I describe it as like falling in cognitive love.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's kind of like autistic people fall in love with these things that we're not interested in. Yeah, the way of putting it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, yeah, I mean, we tend to have relatively restricted interests, but I mean, most of us will kind of hop from interest to interest. Like we will be interested in lots of different things over time. And I think what people mostly mean when they talk about restricted interests is they're baffled that we're not interested in all of the things they're interested in.
Right.
And you know, that's not just about having fewer interests. It's about some common neurotypical interests being incomprehensible to a lot of autistic people. Like I've met autistic people who are into football, for example, but not very many.
Yeah, they are.
I think that's because.
But this is quite. Sorry, I was going to say, but this is where it gets really, really, really interesting because, for example, as someone with a PDA profile, our interests tend to be more social in nature, right? And I can remember being diagnosed and describing myself as a person highly attuned to the feelings of others. And the diagnostician saw that as a potential, not red flag, but as a ruling out factor for my being autistic. And I said, well, the thing is, if my interests were directed more towards non-human activities and objects and things, then I have less interest in people, and as a result, less of an incentive to understand the human condition. But because my special interests are in people, I'm going to be interested in people in a very autistic way. And therefore, I'm going to be mega interested in people. A little like how perhaps an autistic person who is into football will, you know, now the idea of football, the concept of football isn't exactly associated with the autistic experience, but the interest in football will have an autistic feel to it, you know. So that individual will research the hell out of football, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, to really to follow a football game, you kind of need to follow loads of different things going on at once. And again, if someone is sufficiently interested in something, then they can train themselves. There's a thing called chunking, where human brains, as they learn about a thing and get good at a thing, stop thinking about something in terms of like many different players doing different things in different parts of the pitch, and think about an overall pattern to the field, right? And you hear about it in chess, where a grandmaster, just hardly thinks about individual pieces at all. They know that kind of layout of the board corresponds to this and that happening, and it's a much kind of higher level thing. So because of that, because of the phenomenon of chunking, autistic people can get very good at following complex things, right? It doesn't mean that our attention is really spread between many different interests at once, because things get simpler the more you understand them.
Okay.
So back to the diagnostic criteria. Repetitive behaviors, right? Stimming. What's that about? There's a lot about autistic experience, which, to understand it, you need to understand how destabilizing a lot of experiences are for autistic people. So in school, for example, we're constantly being ripped out of whatever attention tunnel we're part of. And most neurotypical people don't seem to understand what a wrench that is, even though the experience of being pulled out of an attention tunnel is actually very common. If someone who's watching a football game, for example, 5 minutes before the end, someone switches off the TV and insists on talking at them about international politics, they're often going to be really pissed off, right? Or like if someone's almost finished their chapter of a book, or so all of these things. And if people understood that autistic people are having that experience multiple times every day, they would have a much greater insight into how bloody destabilizing the world is for an autistic person. So because of it, our stress levels are often very high.
Right.
And also because of the whole social thing, again, like there's a lot of anxiety associated with not being able to predict what people are going to do or to understand what they're thinking. Right? So autistic people are often very stressed out, and stressed out people stim, and that's actually just universal, right? Everyone stims. Autistic people just do it more obviously and probably more of the time, and largely that's because we're more stressed out. But it's also because I think we're more likely to kind of explore stims, right? So we learn how to self-regulate because we really need to, and everyone does to some degree. But because the world is so destabilizing for autistic people, it's absolutely key that we are able to absorb our attention in stimuli that we can control, right? Predictable, controllable things. Because so much of anxiety and so much of kind of feelings of instability are about not feeling in control, not feeling like you have agency in the situation that you're in. So a lot of stimming is about that. And it's also partly about blocking out other stimuli, right? Because as I say, autistic people have fewer filters at any given time, right? So we're less able to filter out unpleasant sensory stimuli. Most people, they stop noticing ticking clocks, for example, or they don't register the smell of perfume or things like that. Autistic people often just cannot do that unless we really kind of like submerge ourselves in stimming or a special interest or something like that.
Yeah, this is what's very interesting, because as we are engrossed in the attention tunnel, we find that the outside world is either ignored or completely unbearable. I mean, I wanted to ask why that is, and there's probably not an easy answer. And I'll put that in my notes because I know you're still describing this. I'm getting ahead of myself. But I was thinking earlier about how you were describing the traumatic experience of being wrenched from an attention tunnel. And I frequently discuss invalidation trauma on my page, and ways in which the autistic person is traumatized that may not be completely obvious to a non-autistic person. And that is one of them. But the sheer nature of being pulled away from a flow state is harrowing, right? And as you said before, perhaps we don't know why that is. We don't know why being pulled away from it is so difficult. I've watched some of my autistic clients move into meltdown rapidly if the game that they're playing glitches for just a second. You know, I can watch them just turn. It's like, now that would annoy most people. You know, and as you said before, you haven't got to the end of the book chapter, or there's a power cut when 5 minutes is left in the football game. Yeah, it's very difficult for the average person to deal with that. But I suppose our global stability isn't the same. The world to us is generally a very, very scary place. So we have these sacred, cozy little activities that we immerse ourselves in. And if they're taken away from us, we've got a lot further to fall, you know?
Yeah. I think there are two sides to that, right? So it's not just about the rest of the world being difficult. It's also that we kind of like pile our interests high, right? So if we're into something, we're really into it. So we pile it up with cognitive resources. And it's like filling a shopping trolley really high, right? You're pushing it along as fast as you can. And then suddenly you have to change direction. And like stuff's going to fall off. If you're not careful, it's going to fall over completely. And it just takes a massive effort to change the direction. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. When that's how I think about being wrenched out of an attention tunnel.
Yeah, because it's weightier. Like, as I said before,
Yeah.
there's more of a gravity to autistic interest. So it's heavy. So it's not as easy for us to maneuver around or move from A to B because there's more weight, you know.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to talk about inertia here.
Yes.
It's a little bit of a problem because inertia is associated more with like difficulty getting going, and that is often a huge thing for autistic people. But you know, in physics, inertia is resistance to a change in motion. So it's just as much difficulty changing direction or stopping as it is getting started.
Yeah.
And I think autistic people have a lot of inertia. It's like a cognitive inertia, basically.
Yeah.
So for me, that's a really useful insight into autistic thinking in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Inertia is that's another thing that's extremely difficult to explain to non-autistic people. It's like, what do you mean? Can't you just move? It's like, it's not as simple as that, you know. My analogy is usually the one that everyone gets universally. It's like when it's freezing cold outside and you're warm in bed early in the morning and you want to hit the snooze button again and again and again. You know, like that with everything. You know, if this conversation feels good, I'm going to be extremely reluctant to move away from it. I can remember that as a child, speaking to people on the phone, doing everything I could to not allow them to hang up the phone, because I was like, no, it's good here. I like it here. Don't make me go out there. Let's stay here. You know, it's like this. I'm in the tundra in a warm capsule, and if you put the phone down, it means that I have to move outside the capsule into the blizzard, you know. So yeah, it's it all links in, you know, all these things. And that's the thing, because there have been various schools of thought and theories attempting to explain the autistic experience, from inertia to problems with executive functioning, perhaps even like, as we've said before, sensory sensitivities and sensory differences. A couple of my clients have asked me before, Harry, why is it that my child can go to the cinema and watch the big screen and tolerate the loud noises blaring from the speakers, But when they're at home and I'm having a conversation with them, if someone turns on the tap or if a tiny little fly comes in the room, you know, all hell breaks loose. And I suppose there's a monotropic explanation there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those contexts at home, those are going to be distractions, right? Like they're going to pull the kid out of their attention tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at the cinema, you're at the cinema. You don't have to think about anything else. Like, you know that whatever comes on the screen is just going to be part of the film. You know that whatever comes out of the speakers is part of the film. So, yeah, I mean, it's predictable, basically. And that makes it much easier to deal with.
Yeah. My attention tunnel today keeps on going back to school and monotropism, because to me, I'm always trying to find the ultimate explanation for why so many of these kids have such a difficult time. And I can't help but feel monotropism explains beautifully why the autistic mind just does not thrive, because it's not always obvious. Not every kid is bullied at school. Not every kid finds it easy to ascertain the reasons they find the environment so distressing. And it's like, well, yeah, if you have a very specific special interest or passion, whatever we want to call it, and school do everything in their power to pull you away from that and impose upon you their own series of topics that may have absolutely nothing to do with your special interests, that's going to be very traumatic to an autistic mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, one aspect of monotropism is, yeah, just huge difficulty getting your mind to follow any track which is not aligned with your interests.
Right.
And at schools, we're constantly demanding that kids do X, Y, or Z, regardless of how interesting it is to them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's, you know, it's one of these things which is a problem for basically everyone, right? Like, it's actually kind of horrible and tiring having to pay attention to things that you're not inherently interested in. Like, everyone finds that. William James was remarking on this in his work on psychology in the 19th century. Like, it's just unpleasant having to pay attention to things that you don't care about. But the whole way that our school system is structured requires it. You know, it doesn't matter how much you hate maths, you're still going to have to learn maths.
It's like, I'm bored is a medical emergency for an autistic person.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah,
that's a bloody good reason for me to get the hell out of this place, you know, because, yeah, my brain cannot possibly engage if it's surrounded by uninteresting material.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, a good teacher with a small enough class can usually make things interesting to most kids.
They can make it interesting in...
Yeah, you know, by linking in with things which the kid cares about.
Right.
Mostly. Or, you know, just making it fun. Engaging their interests one way or another.
Okay. Take note, teachers. And you're a teacher, aren't you?
I am, yeah, I'm a science teacher.
Sure.
I have been a maths teacher, but I think I wasn't passionate enough about maths to be a particularly good maths teacher for kids who cared about maths much less than I did. Who, you know, by the time I only ever taught relatively low ability classes in maths. And by the time you've got a 14, 15-year-old who is going to those kind of maths classes, they hate maths, right? They are deeply turned off. It makes them anxious. It upsets them. They expect to fail, and they do a lot of the time. So, you know, I can explain mathematical concepts quite happily, and I'm personally enthusiastic about quite a lot of topics within maths, but I never planned to be a maths teacher. That's just what I ended up getting a job teaching chemistry and maths after training to be a physics teacher.
Okay.
and I was glad of the work.
Yeah.
And I love teaching chemistry. Like, chemistry is a delightful topic to teach, with lots of fun experiments, which I appreciate. But yeah, the maths, I didn't have good maths teachers when I was a kid, so I've seen very little good maths teaching in my life. And I felt that at university as well, that most of my maths lecturers, because I studied physics and philosophy at university, most of my math lecturers were not particularly good at making it interesting to people who were not mathematicians.
Okay. I'm interested in how you, as a teacher and as perhaps the person who is continuing your mother's legacy to some extent in monotropism, what would you do if one of your students was uninterested? Like, because so traditionally in school, it's perhaps viewed as a fault on the part of the student, if they're not engaging, and perhaps a more traditional disciplinary method is employed at that point. But you, as an expert in monotropism, as well as a teacher of physics, chemistry, etc., like what happens in those situations? Do you, like what are your, how would you respond?
So I try and find out what the student is interested in.
Okay.
And make connections between that and whatever I'm teaching.
Okay.
And it has to be said that given the rigid nature of school curricula, that is not always possible.
Yes.
But it is very often possible. If you understand what a kid's passionate about and you know your subject sufficiently well, there are very often hooks that you can pull them in with. And once they start getting interested and start getting the idea that this is something that they might actually be good at some point, then they're likely to get more interested in the subject in general.
Sure. In a lot of my work, I have devised my own way of making sense of the interest-based nature of the autistic mind, and I describe primary and secondary focuses. So I perhaps would describe how just teaching a kid to read for reading's sake could be a futile exercise or ineffective, because reading as a standalone activity may have little to no point or relevance to the child's life. But if first and foremost we recognize what the child's primary focus is, which would be synonymous with the special interest, then perhaps reading could be used as a secondary focus. It's like, well, no, reading takes secondary importance. If we impose reading upon the student as a primary goal, the autistic student may think, why? It has no relevance to my life. What's the point? But if you happen to find out that they're interested in, I don't know, history of a particular ancient civilization, I mean, why they wouldn't know how to read at that point, I wouldn't know, but bear with me. If they happen to be interested in the history of an ancient civilization, and then you introduce reading as a useful tool by which they can access more of that topic, then it changes the way they see reading. It's like, oh, well, at first, when you were like, I've got to go to this reading class, who cares? That my brain can't engage. But now that you have demonstrated that reading is a useful way for me to understand more about my special interest, suddenly it's a different ball game.
Yeah. And I think if our education system was more flexible, then that would be possible a lot more of the time. And I think trails of special interest will lead people a long way if they're allowed to follow them.
Yes.
So if you just let a kid learn about whatever they're interested in at any given time, they will learn loads of different things, right?
Yeah.
Sooner or later, they're almost certain to be motivated to learn to read, for example.
Yes, rhizomatic, it branches out, like.
Yeah. And maths comes into most things sooner or later.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
you know, everything involves science.
Right. This is
Everything
it.
has a history and, you know, geographical aspects to it. But we don't allow kids to approach things from the angles that they're interested in. And most classes in most schools are too big to make it feasible for teachers to do that most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as a consequence, most kids spend most of their school days for years doing things that they're not particularly interested in. And as you say, that's actually downright traumatic for a lot of autistic kids.
Of course, it is.
And I think, you know, the ADHD kids have much the same problem, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important point. If we are deprived of interest, then, well, we run into cognitive nutritional deficiencies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, this brings us back to flow states, right? You mentioned the idea of flow earlier.
I was just, my next question was literally, what is a flow state?
Yeah, okay. So, so flow states are a pretty familiar idea, right? Musicians talk about being in the zone, so do sports people. And I think that people talked about, you know, flow and being in the flow before Csikszentmihalyi wrote about it.
I was going to try and pronounce his name again. I've never known a name more difficult to pronounce. Csikszentmihalyi?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Pretty much, okay. Yes.
Yeah. So
I recommend Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Just so everyone can see it before they rush off to purchase it. Good stuff. Continue.
Yeah, fortunately, the book is just called Flow, so that's nice and easy.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, a flow state is one that someone gets completely absorbed in. It's usually associated with a level of challenge which meets someone's current level of skill. So it's challenging, but it's not too challenging. So it takes all of your resources to keep on doing the thing.
But by its very nature, it's restoring energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Reciprocal.
Exactly.
It's reciprocity.
Right.
But yes,
yeah. So yeah, basically it's like losing yourself in an activity. Often people lose track of time when they're in a flow state.
Yeah.
And
lose track of their bladder movements and their wake cycle and their signals for them to go and nourish themselves. It's it's immersive and transcendental.
Yeah. So notably, all of those things are strongly associated with autism. And pathologized in the context of autism. Like, it's treated as a problem that autistic people are acting like they're in a flow state all the time.
But this is what's really, really interesting, because the flow state is an explanation for what people feel when they're chanting or engaged in some other religious ritual, or even a meditative state,
Right.
or, you know, when someone has a religious experience, or it's almost like I can remember years ago describing the autistic person as having meditation as their default state. And I don't just mean sitting cross-legged in a lotus position chanting Om. I mean, like, no, the stimming and the repetition and the tendency for us to gravitate towards this kind of central point at which the world disappears and we become one with our activity. You know, it's like we're always trying to get there. We're always trying to get to that blissful state, aren't we?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's something that everyone needs. You know, Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow as the key to happiness. And I think that's probably not much of an exaggeration. Like, it is central to human well-being that people get to engage with things fully, that really, you know, take their full attention. But autistic people, I think, one, it's probably much easier for us to enter flow states, and two, it totally does our heads in if we don't get the opportunity to. So, you know, if we're cut off from our special interests or we're prevented from stimming, you know, we're not just not flowing, but we're like turbulent as hell.
No, yeah, that's what I mean. And this is yet another example of why the mainstream school system does not work for the vast majority of us, because we are deprived of accessing that flow state, and the flow state is the default. We do everything.
Yeah. So another characteristic of flow states is that they're the best way to learn, basically. Like, people learn more when they're in a flow state than they will in any other states. So, you know, if you're trying to master a skill, once you kind of get to the point of having just enough mastery to keep on going, like, you really keep on going. Like, you can learn so much more than if you weren't able to lose yourself in it like that.
Exactly. I mean, I'm just thinking about years ago, and we don't talk a lot about masking ADHD in this community, but I've attempted to bring it into conversation before. I can remember thinking, a lot of the other kids in my class are reading certain books, and I will as well, because they are, and I don't like missing out. I want to see what it's all about. And I can remember just thinking, no matter how hard I try, I cannot absorb a single piece of information from these books because there is no fundamental interest whatsoever, you know, compared to when I'm reading something related to my special interest, and it's just pouring in. It's just everything opens up. That's the point at which the autistic mind becomes receptive. You utilize the interest, and suddenly you open up the whole world, and you know, there's room for unlimited information, seemingly.
Yeah. And again, it's not just autistic people, even though I think it's, you know, of far more central importance for autistic people. But you know, there's a whole kind of movement for self-directed learning in education. And there's a fair amount of evidence that kids who are allowed to engage in self-directed learning really thrive, like better mental health, and not necessarily better results academically, but not necessarily any worse either.
Okay. What inspired your mother to look into all of this? Where did it come from?
Yeah, good question. So when I was a kid, she was doing a PhD in the linguistics department at UCL, on the topic of language and interests. So sort of psycholinguistics, relevance theory for anyone who follows linguistics. Although her thesis was sort of pointing up some problems with relevance theory as it was then practiced, which kind of got her thesis supervisors back up quite badly, I think. Although a couple of decades later, looking at what's happened to relevance theory since, it kind of looks like they eventually accepted her points. Yeah, so she was thinking about how interests shape the way that people communicate, and what that means for how we think. So she had the idea of the mind as an interest system then, basically, and she published her PhD thesis in 1986, I think, when I was 8. Having done it while raising 3 kids with 2 years between each of us. So a few years after that, when someone lent her, I think, Uta Frith's book, Autism, the Enigma, she read it and thought, that doesn't seem that enigmatic to me. I'm pretty sure I can explain all of that. Like, if it's just that autistic minds have fewer interests aroused at any time, then all of this stuff falls into place. So she read a lot about autism, and she met up with the autism experts, and eventually kind of got hooked up with a bunch of autistic people. She worked as a support worker for years, and kind of, she didn't want to just assume that she had correctly intuited exactly what was going on without actually meeting some autistic people and talking to them. But basically, yeah, everything validated the way that she was thinking. So that's how it came about, basically. It fitted in with what she'd been thinking anyway.
Right.
And meeting more autistic people just convinced her that she had it right, basically. And she developed the idea further with, as I say, her friend Mike Lesser and Wenn Lawson. And Wenn Lawson turned out to have had very much the same ideas about autism in Australia around about the same time.
Right.
So when their paths finally crossed, it was like, hey, but so they got together. Like when it sort of worked out some things that my mum hadn't, and made connections that Dinah hadn't, and vice versa. Like, I think Wen was thinking about what this meant for autistic sensory experiences before Dinah really considered that.
Awesome.
Or thought that monotropism could explain it.
Did she name it?
She actually kind of asked her friend Jeanette Bursky to come up with a name for it. So she was the one who actually suggested the name monotropism.
Right, got it. And was your mum...
When I think had been talking about single attention and associated cognition.
Yes, Sachs. Yeah, I think he called it that. Was your mum consciously autistic at the time?
No. So
so she was monotropic about monotropism.
Yeah, she was
realizing
that. Yeah, like
bloody monotropic.
I assume she realized pretty quickly that she had sort of tendencies in that direction.
Yes.
But to be fair, I mean, it's quite possible that she wouldn't have qualified for diagnosis under DSM-3.
Sure.
And possibly not even DSM-4. I'm not 100% sure. Because they broadened the definition of autism.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point she was talking to her autistic friend Ferenc Virag, who is non-speaking and sort of quite obviously autistic. I hesitate to use that phrase, but there are some people who you meet them, and if you know autism, then you just know that they're autistic.
As autistic people, we have a license to say that.
Pretty much. Lots of autistic people, just to emphasize this, are not at all obviously autistic, and you shouldn't assume. Anyway, so Ferenc is, quite disabled, and very monotropic.
Yeah.
And at some point, my mum was saying something to him about autistic people like you, like cats, I think is what she was saying. I slightly question this analogy, but there is something to it. Whereas non-autistic people like me are more like dogs, I think she was saying. And Ferenc looked at her like, non-autistic? Obviously, as I say, he's non-speaking, but he said it with his face.
Yeah.
So that kind of got her thinking, oh, yeah, right. I guess he has a point, I think.
Of course.
And I think it took a while for her to sort of fully identify as autistic. She never sought a formal diagnosis. But like she edited a book called Coming Out Asperger's. When was that? 90? No, hang on. When would it have been? Early 2000s. And her chapter in that was about how she was kind of on the cusp of counting as autistic or not.
Right.
So like most of the autistic people that she knew recognized her as, you know, one of them, one of us.
Of course. I mean,
But
she had to come up with such a groundbreaking theory. That's got such a profoundly clear insight into our experience. I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to allow people to ask a few questions. We have one here, it seems. Let's see. Question of sorts from Sally Jew Sailor. My son is not interested in learning about his special interest at school at all. He won't allow me to tell them his interest at all, as he hates them mentioning or using it to interest him. I think he learns autonomously and only autonomously about his special interest. So I presume he can only get into flow when he has unlimited time and chooses what he learns himself. He is autistic, not PDA, not ADHD. What do you make of that, Fergus?
Well, I wonder if the kid's embarrassed about special interests. Like, is that why they don't want them coming up at school?
Yeah.
I think also these things can be quite private, right? Like, I don't know.
I think it's as well. I think what I'm thinking about here is that he's compartmentalizing, and whilst he is at school, the interest that is aroused is that of masking and fitting in, and may not necessarily have the time or attention resources available to pour into his special interests, and perhaps combine that with the shame that many of us feel about our autistic authenticity. Yeah. You can, and also I'm interested in not responding favorably to the teacher's attempts to engage the interest, because there is a wrong way to do that.
Yeah, I can imagine that being very cringy.
Right. Yeah, because you can tell they're not really interested. They're just trying to get you to do work.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Like I hear about teachers kind of like just inserting special interests into things which are not really relevant. Like,
yeah.
Oh yeah. So what do you get if you add 3 minions and 8 minions? Not really the point.
They did that with my cousin, but with frozen examples, and I could see where they were coming from, but it was all wrong. Do you think they wouldn't want anyone questioning them in school about their special interests? Oh, perhaps. Do we have any last questions for Fergus before we wrap this conversation up, related to monotropism or special interests? And yeah, good point, Kirsty. Maybe he knows that they're going to use it against him to manipulate him. That's a good point. Absolutely.
There's a lot that it's useful to think about in terms of not wanting to be manipulated.
Right.
Like Dinah talks a lot about how a lot of cases of so-called regression where kids stop using language can be explained by the kid realizing that language is a tool for other people to come in and manipulate their interest systems and like try and make them think about things that they don't really want to think about.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, I see. This has been great. Oh, thanks, Morgan. Cool. Just having a look to see if anyone has any final questions. It was quite an information-laden evening, but people have really enjoyed it, and yeah, they've been very much engrossed, very much in the flow. That's good. Awesome. Okay then. Well, Fergus, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Harry.
I, for one, feel enlightened, and it's just such a fascinating topic. And yeah, monotropism, everyone, do look it up. There are quite a few papers on it, but yeah, significantly explains the autistic experience. So yes, we're extremely lucky to have Fergus here.
For it's worth, I had an article about monotropism in The Psychologist in 2019.
All right.
Me and Monotropism, a unified theory of autism.
Yes.
So you can find that online.
Yeah, I've read it myself and it's fantastic. So yeah, Fergus, thank you very much. And everyone else, I'll see you next week. Awesome. Goodbye. Cheers.